Great. Thank you, Alton. And I will, hopefully this works. Okay. So I will get started. Thank you all for joining us. We released our national survey data on Asian Americans a couple of weeks ago, and we're pleased to present data from California today, as well as data on Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders. In addition to me presenting data on California, Janelle Wong, who's also principal investigator on the project, will present our findings. We'll discuss our findings on Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders, and we will post these on our website after the webinar is over. After that, we will have commentary from Calvin Chang from Empowered Pacific Islander Communities, or EPIC, and then from Karen Wang from Asian Americans Advancing Justice LA. And then finally, Alton Wong from AAPI Vote will talk about the efforts they are doing nationally to reach out to AAPI voters. So in terms of taking a deeper look at the Asian American electorate in California, this is drawing on some fact sheets, state fact sheets that we developed with AAPI Vote. There are over 3.7 million eligible AAPI voters in California. This is the citizen voting age population, and that constitutes nearly 15% of the state's electorate. Importantly, this includes Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders alone, as well as in combination. There's a significant multiracial Asian American and Pacific Islander population in California. From 2000 to 2010, the number of eligible AAPI voters in California grew by 38%. And if you look at the resident population, California is home to more than 6 million AAPIs and about 300,000 Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders, which is more than for any other state except for Hawaii. AAPI youth in California comprise 23% of the citizen voting age population, and those aged 50 and up comprise 40% of the AAPI citizen voting age population. In terms of findings from our survey, like what we found nationally, the Democratic Party has an advantage among Asian Americans in California, and it remains strong. Only 25% of Asian Americans express strong favorability for Hillary Clinton, but that is still double the favorability that Donald Trump receives. Overall, Hillary has a strong net favorability rating, whereas Donald Trump has a strong net unfavorability rating. Most Asian Americans intend to vote for Hillary Clinton in November, with Korean and Indian Americans expressing the strongest support and Filipinos expressing the lowest levels of support. When it comes to the Senate race, most Asian Americans are undecided in their support for Kamala Harris versus Loretta Sanchez, pointing to the important need for voter outreach. But among those who have decided, Harris leads among all groups except for Vietnamese. And then finally, on most issues, Asian Americans are progressive, but there are a couple of exceptions, most notably for California with the legalization of marijuana on the ballot. Asian Americans overall are opposed to legalizing marijuana. These findings are especially important, and especially the marijuana legalization finding, given that Asian Americans were 12% of the electorate in 2014 and will probably be an even slightly higher proportion of the electorate this time around. In terms of issues, Asian American registered voters rank the economy, national security, racism, government, and immigration as the most important problem facing the country. Healthcare and education are important personal concerns. And like I said, they hold progressive attitudes on most issues. Ethnic media is an important source of information for particular Asian American groups. And there's a pressing need for Asian American voter outreach, especially given the reported lack of contact by parties and candidates. In terms of the methodology, we were able to rely on some additional interviews than when we released our last report. So these interviews go through last week, through October 12th, through the end of last week, essentially. This is based on listed samples available from Catalyst. We report here on registered voters. So we have 791 Asian American registered voters in California, The overall margin of error is 4.5%. And those are the largest national origin groups that you see. Even though we included Cambodian and Hmong Americans, the number of registered voters was too small for us to be able to break out the separate numbers, but they do go into the Asian American estimate for the state. So first, in terms of party identification, what we find is that Asian Americans are about twice as likely. This is looking at registered voters. They're about twice as likely to identify as Democrat as Republican. But what you'll see there is that a significant chunk, so 42% of registered voters still do not call themselves Democrat or Republican. When you look at it by age, gender, and nativity, we find that millennials, those age 18 to 34, are more likely to identify as nonpartisan, but they're also slightly more likely to identify as Democrat. They're much less likely to identify as Republican. There are no significant gender differences, and there are slight differences by nativity as well. Now, one of the things that we do, like many other survey researchers do, is to ask people who say they don't identify with either party, or if they say that they're independent, we ask which way they lean, if they feel closer to the Democratic Party or closer to the Republican Party. Using this measure, again, we see about a 2-to-1 advantage, and that we see that a majority of Asian American registered voters either identify as Democrat or feel closer to the Democratic Party. For Republicans, it's about a quarter. And there are significant ethnic differences here, with the lowest Republican identification among Indian Americans and the highest levels of Republican identification among Japanese and Vietnamese Americans. That said, among Japanese Americans, a majority either identify or lean towards the Democratic Party, and among Vietnamese Americans, a greater proportion now lean or identify as Democrats as opposed to Republican. Again, there are some interesting differences that come out not when we look at gender, but when we look at age and at nativity. Next, we'll look at favorability ratings for Obama, Trump, and Clinton. So for Barack Obama, 2/3 of Asian American registered voters in California hold a favorable view of Obama, and Obama has slightly higher favorability ratings among Asian Americans nationally. Obama's favorability rating is strongest among Indian Americans and Korean Americans, and it's weakest among Vietnamese Americans. In terms of differences by age, gender, and nativity, again, we find significant differences by age, and when you see it by nativity, there are significant differences as well in terms of native-born Asian Americans having more significant favorability than foreign-born Asian Americans. In terms of Donald Trump, he's viewed much more unfavorably among Asian Americans than Barack Obama is. So 62% of Asian American registered voters in California have an unfavorable view of Donald Trump. And the unfavorability is particularly high among Indian Americans, but it's also high among Korean Americans and Japanese Americans. Vietnamese Americans are the only ones who do not have a net unfavorable rating of Donald Trump. Nationally, Trump's unfavorables are slightly lower among Asian Americans than it is in California. When we look by age, we find that Trump's unfavorables are very high among millennials, and this is true at the national level as well. There are no significant gender differences in unfavorability towards Trump, and native-born Asian Americans have a much more unfavorable view of Donald Trump than foreign-born Asian Americans. Looking next for Hillary Clinton, we find that Hillary Clinton, in contrast to Trump, is viewed much more favorably. So if you look at her favorable rating, it is at 57% versus 36% who view her unfavorably. Her favorability rating is highest among Indian Americans and Korean Americans and is lowest among Vietnamese Americans. Nationally, the findings on Clinton favorability are similar. And when we look at millennials, we find that, again, similar to what we found nationally, Trump's unfavorables among millennials was 60%, and who viewed Trump very unfavorably. For Clinton, only 19% of millennial Asian American registered voters view her very unfavorably. There are no significant differences by gender. They're slight, but not statistically significant. But there are significant differences by nativity, with the unfavorability rating higher for the native-born than the foreign-born for Hillary Clinton. When it comes to the presidential vote choice, we asked this question in two ways. One is we asked if the election were held today, which presidential candidate, before we go to the presidential vote choice for November, we asked about the primary vote, and we found that Clinton won the Asian American primary vote in California by a very significant margin. 57% of those who voted in the primaries voted for Clinton, 19% for Sanders, 18% for Trump, and 6% for all others. Similarly to what we found nationally, we find that millennials provided a significant source of support for Bernie Sanders, but importantly, Hillary Clinton won even the millennial Asian American vote in California with 44% versus 39% for Sanders. Now, in terms of the general election in November, we asked, thinking about the upcoming November election for president, if the election were being held today, would you be inclined to vote for Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump, or some other candidate? We find that a majority of Asian American registered voters say that they would vote for Hillary Clinton, with support strongest among Korean Americans and Indian Americans, and support weakest among Vietnamese Americans. Nationally, the findings are quite similar to what we find in California. When we look by age, gender, and nativity, we don't find that many significant differences, although where the differences pop out are among those who say that they would vote for some other candidate. That's higher among millennial Asian Americans, among males, and among the native-born. Next, among those who said that they didn't know or they refused to answer who they would vote for at this time, we asked if they feel closer, if they're leaning towards voting for Clinton, or they're leaning towards voting for Trump or towards some other candidate. When we take these so-called leaners into account, we see that 58% of Asian American voters in California say that they will vote for Hillary Clinton, whereas 19% say that they'll vote for Donald Trump, with 9% saying that they would support other candidates. In terms of congressional vote choice, first, in terms of the Senate race, we find that a majority of Asian American registered voters do not know who they're going to vote for between Kamala Harris and Loretta Sanchez. So this is very significant. We're only a month before Election Day, and most Asian Americans have not made up their minds in this election. Very likely, the fact that it's not a competition between a Democrat and a Republican has somewhat to do with this. People cannot rely on party labels to figure out who they'll vote for. We do find that among those who've made up their mind that Harris enjoys a significant lead over Sanchez, but there are some significant ethnic differences. Among Indian Americans, Kamala Harris does much better than Loretta Sanchez does, with 56% saying that they'll vote for her. Notably, Kamala Harris is African American and Indian American. By contrast, among Vietnamese Americans, among those who've made up their minds, a far greater proportion say that they'll vote for Loretta Sanchez as opposed to Kamala Harris. And this also makes sense, given that Loretta Sanchez has a House district in Orange County with a significant Vietnamese American constituency. Next, we asked about the generic House ballot. And here we find that Actually, these numbers are flipped. My apologies for that. We'll fix it when we upload it. It's 52% for Democrat, 24% for Republican, with Democratic support strongest among Indian Americans and weakest among Vietnamese Americans. Next, in terms of issue priorities and policy preferences, I'll go through this pretty quickly to then hand it off to Janelle Wong, who'll talk about Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders and their presidential vote choice and issue preferences. We find, similarly to the national average for Asian Americans, there's significant support for the Affordable Care Act among Asian American registered voters. There's also significant support for federal assistance to help undergraduates pay tuition at public colleges without needing loans. And notably, support is strongest among Vietnamese Americans here. And noting, and this is particularly true, notable given the significant upward mobility in educational attainment for Vietnamese Americans and other Southeast Asian groups when you go from the first immigrant generation to subsequent generations. Vietnamese Americans also tend to have lower incomes in California than other Asian American groups. So that might also help explain this higher level of support for federal assistance among Vietnamese Americans. Now, next, when we look at whether there should be a ban on Muslims from entering the United States, we find that a majority of Asian Americans oppose such a ban. This is similar to what we find nationally, also similar to what we found in the spring 2006 Asian American voter survey. There are some significant ethnic differences here, though, with opposition to a ban on Muslim immigrants lowest among Vietnamese Americans. Next, we also asked about whether people would support or oppose accepting Syrian refugees into the United States. And we find the Asian American community essentially split on this issue. This is very similar to what we find nationally. And there are some significant ethnic differences here, with support for Syrian refugees highest among Indian Americans and Korean Americans, and support lowest among Vietnamese Americans. And other journalists have noted the irony of this, especially given that Vietnamese Americans are a largely refugee population in the United States, and we find support for accepting Syrian refugees lowest among this group in California. Turning next to marijuana legalization, this is on the ballot in California. And our prediction, given Asian American attitudes, we did not ask specifically about how they would vote on this ballot proposition. We asked Asian Americans in California, as well as Asian Americans elsewhere, whether they would support or oppose legalizing the possession of small amounts of marijuana for personal use. And we find that Asian Americans are strongly opposed to the legalization of marijuana. So while marijuana legalization may pass in California, the sizable Asian American electorate in California will probably make that contest closer than it otherwise would be. We also have data on climate change, and we asked whether Asian American registered voters support or oppose setting stricter emission limits on power plants in order to address climate change. California has taken the lead on many of these measures, and we find that Asian Americans are strong supporters of stricter emission limits on power plants, and this is similar to what we find nationally. So a key point there is that Asian Americans are environmental voters, as well as supportive of other progressive issues. And then finally, when it comes to racial justice, we asked if Asian Americans in California support or oppose the government doing more to give Blacks equal rights with whites. And we find very strong support for this notion, with 72% in support and 14% opposed. Finally, I'll just say something briefly about where people get their information. Internet and social media is the most popular source, followed by television, radio, and magazines. Friends and family are also an important source of information. And we asked if people rely more on information, how much they rely on information from an older generation, someone from their same generation, and someone from a younger generation. Similarly to what we found nationally, though Asian American registered voters, if they rely on information from friends and family, are most likely to do so from those in their peer age group. This is important when it comes to voter education and outreach efforts, where peer efforts seem to be more successful than those that rely on intergenerational strategies. Although those strategies are not ineffective, we find that people do rely on information from those in older generations when it comes to information about politics. And then finally, when it comes to ethnic media versus mainstream media, we find that Asian Americans generally rely on mainstream media more than ethnic media. But when you combine both ethnic exclusively as well as ethnic and mainstream, we find that about 42% rely on ethnic media using that broader category, and about a quarter rely on ethnic media exclusively. There are some significant ethnic differences here, with Chinese Americans, Korean Americans, and Vietnamese Americans relying much more heavily on ethnic media. And this is important for parties and campaigns to know that in order to reach those particular communities, they need to be advertising not only in mainstream media, but also in ethnic and Asian language media. In the interest of time, I'll just quickly conclude to talk about social media activism. So we find that social media activism is significant among Asian American millennial voters and among among the native born in California. And this is important to recognize as well when it comes to voter mobilization and voter outreach in California, especially when it comes to millennial registered voters. Finally, I'll just say that the findings that we have in California mirror what we find nationally. In fact, the lack of voter contact is even more severe in California, although it's not statistically significant, the difference. Only 26% of Asian American registered voters in California say that they've been contacted by political parties or campaigns. This is extremely low, and when we compare it to national findings for other racial groups, a significantly larger proportion of whites, blacks, and Latinos say that they've been contacted by political parties and candidates. The lack of contact is especially significant for Asian American millennial voters, only 20% of whom say that they have been contacted by political parties or campaigns. So this points to the need for a lot of work that needs to be done by political parties, Democrats as well as Republicans, in terms of reaching out to Asian American registered voters and especially Asian American millennial registered voters in California. Okay, I'll turn it over to Janelle Wong, who will discuss the findings for Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders.
Thank you for being here, everyone. Good morning. So we're very pleased to be able to present some new data on Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders and their views on the upcoming election. Just to provide some background, we have included some statistics. I won't go over all of them here, but to note, Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders are a very fast-growing group, one of the fastest-growing groups in the United States. Native Hawaiians make up a big chunk, 43% of the population, but it's also a very diverse group with 20 other groups included under the NHPI umbrella. While they are concentrated in Hawaii, California, Washington, and sort of traditional gateway states, we also see that the fastest growing populations are in Arkansas and Alaska, but notably Nevada, a swing state. Next slide. Let me get to the key findings here. Similar to the Asian American population, we see that Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders are much more likely to identify as Democrats than Republicans, but there are, at the same time, a very large number, 40%, of those who don't identify with either of the two major parties. Interestingly, younger NHPIs and women were more likely to identify as Democrat. We note that only 10% of NHPIs feel very favorably toward Donald Trump, while 30% feel the same way about Hillary Clinton. We'll talk about this perhaps in the Q&A a bit more, but about half of all NHPIs supported Hillary Clinton in the primaries, but we also saw very strong support for Bernie Sanders. So nearly a quarter of all Native Hawaiians and 20% of other Pacific Islanders supported Bernie Sanders in the primary. The bottom line as we approach the November election is that NHPI voters are planning to support Hillary Clinton, 38% over Trump's 16%. So we expect them to vote for Clinton. At the same time, a very large proportion of both Native Hawaiians, 24%, and other Pacific Islanders, an astonishing 34%, say they plan to vote for some other candidate. Next slide. So this is based, I wanted to give you the highlights, but in case you want to do more background research on how we collected this data, we'll make sure we post this slide. It included over 300 NHPI, so that's a very unusual kind of sample, including 172 Native Hawaiians and 184 other Pacific Islanders. And we are reporting the data from 302 registered voters who were interviewed in both landline and cell phones. Next slide. So in terms of party identification, obviously NHPIs are leaning towards the Democrats. They are aligning with the larger Asian American population in that respect. Next slide. In terms of favorability, we note that, not surprisingly, given the coverage over the last 8 years and given Obama's ties to Hawaii, 70% of NHPIs favor Obama. Think of him in very favorable terms. It's also notable that 50% say that they feel favorably toward Hillary Clinton. So it looks like that trend will continue, although Hillary Clinton does not receive nearly the same degree of favorable responses as President Obama. Next slide. And we talked about the vote choice, that we expect that NHPIs will throw their support behind Clinton, but there is this chunk of people who are planning to vote for some other candidate. And we want to talk more about who that might be in the Q&A. Next slide. In terms of congressional vote choice, Native Hawaiians, 69% of Native Hawaiians are planning to vote for the Democratic candidate. That's a very strong voting bloc. In terms of other Pacific Islanders, 56% of other Pacific Islanders say that they're planning to vote for the Democrats. So 69% of Native Hawaiians, 56% of other Pacific Islanders. We also note that fully 18% of other Pacific Islanders say they're going to vote for a third-party candidate. In contrast, 7% of Native Hawaiians say they're going to vote for a third-party candidate. So it's interesting to see this kind of lean, distinctive group that is planning to vote for an alternative candidate at different levels, both up and down the ballot. Next slide. So our last set of analyses were on opinions toward other opinions on different political issues, and these statistics largely mirror the Asian American population as a whole. In terms of the Affordable Care Act, there's very strong support for making college more affordable through federal spending. We see that Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders oppose a ban on Muslim immigrants. This is actually switched in terms of the statistics. We'll have to fix this, I'm sorry, after this presentation's over. 40% say that they would oppose marijuana legalization, And in terms of Syrian refugees, that's where we see 45% supporting and 47% opposing. So again, we see that not only the Asian American community appears split on the Syrian refugee issue, but also the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander community also appears split. In terms of environmental concerns, 66% of Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders support stricter emission limits. And also, when we ask about equality for Black Americans, 68%, which is a very high proportion, support the government doing more to ensure equality. And so we just underscore that this is really structural support for structural reforms, policies to address inequality in the U.S. between Blacks and whites. All right, so we'd love to open it up to Richard Calvin Chang from EPIC and to Karen Wang to give us some responses to this data.
Hi, thank you for this opportunity. My organization is based in Los Angeles, and our mission is to promote social justice by engaging Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander communities through culturally relevant advocacy, research, and development. So empowering Pacific Islanders, our policy priorities include data transparency and disaggregation. As was just previously mentioned, Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander label is an umbrella term that encompasses over 20 different communities, each with their own history, culture, and traditions. And that's very rarely taken into account and most often described in many different data reports as falling under the Asian Pacific Islander label. And so it's key for our communities to be able to access the data that accurately describes where they are on many of these issues and the challenges that they face so that they can make sure these issues are addressed. And my organization also helps promote culturally sensitive research, and in partnership with Advancing Justice, have produced the first demographic report of its kind, or NHPIs, in the United States. But we're also interested in developing a national network that can hopefully bring together Pacific Islander organizations from across the U.S. To advocate for issues at the national level. These findings are not terribly surprising to us because much of what we've been hearing throughout this campaign has been that income inequality and poverty is one of the highest priority issues for our community. Unfortunately, we fall much closer on the socioeconomic spectrum to where African Americans and Latino communities are, in contrast with many of the larger Asian American communities. And because of that, I think that's why it's fair to say that there's such strong support for structural reform that can address income inequality. And the sense we've been getting is that the strong support for candidates like Bernie Sanders unfortunately hasn't completely transferred over to Hillary Clinton. And I think that might explain why there may be a hesitation on many of the progressive-leaning members of the NHPI community to state that they are willing to support Hillary at this time. And I think that explains a great chunk of the folks that are willing to say that they're planning on voting for other candidates. But there are also some issues particular to the Pacific Islander community that haven't been getting much attention by any of the candidates at all. And it covers issues as wide-ranging from federal recognition by the federal government for Native Hawaiians, also the ability to continue federal programs that are meant to specifically benefit Native Hawaiians. That's something that has been under attack in recent years, especially at the Supreme Court level. And of course, there's the issue of birthright citizenship for American Samoa that has also been getting much more attention recently. And so those are topics that, unfortunately, many of the candidates haven't really discussed at any length that stand to impact where NHPIs are. So those are my thoughts and reactions to this data. And if I could just add, a disproportionate number of Pacific Islanders are represented in the armed forces. And given the unfortunate treatment of many of our veterans by services like the VA, There is some question as to whether or not it would make a significant difference with Hillary Clinton taking a more hawkish stance on foreign policy than Donald Trump. But that may explain some of the willingness to vote for another candidate as well.
Okay, great. Thank you, Calvin. Next, we have Karen from Asian Americans Advancing Justice, Los Angeles.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Karthik and Janelle, for having me on, and thanks to everyone who has dialed in. Wanted just to briefly introduce us. Advancing Justice LA is the nation's largest civil rights legal group focused on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. We are also part of a national affiliation, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, across the country with partners in San Francisco, Atlanta, Chicago, and DC. Our own organization focuses heavily on legal cases and policy advocacy on racial and social justice issues, including immigration, workers' rights, education access, language rights, voting rights, etc. This particular year, but in general, we are also heavily engaged in various civic engagement issues. Our focus is heavily on Southern California, and I think at the end you'll hear from AAPI Vote on their national voter work. But for Advancing Justice LA, we are coordinating one of the largest Asian American Pacific Islander citizenship campaigns in the nation, and there's actually been a doubling of interest in citizenship applications going back to the beginning of the year. We've heard anecdotally from a lot of people in our communities who are trying to get naturalized in time to vote this year and have been happy to help many of them. We've also anchored 20 groups in Southern California that are doing Get Out the Vote in the primaries and in the general election. We're calling in 12 languages. We're calling close to 70,000 calls in Southern California. Again, this issue of mobilizing and getting our communities out to vote on these very important issues that the NAAS survey outlined. And then I also wanted to mention that one of our concerns in this upcoming election is voter protection. And you've heard a lot of comments in the media, I think particularly in the recent weeks, around potential voter intimidation happening at the polls. And so we have historically mobilized to go out and observe the polls on Election Day. Our main focus is on ensuring that limited English proficient voters are able to get out there and cast their votes. There's actually both state and federal laws that require some level of language assistance for many Asian communities in California. And our goal this year is to fan out across the state with volunteers to make sure that those rights are protected. So we're working with Advancing Justice ALC in San Francisco on that, and hoping we will not see anything terrible happening, but preparing in case that we do. And finally, as a legal group, we're involved in a lot of legal cases, including lawsuits to help ensure that Asian Americans are able to elect the candidates of their choices that are involved in a lawsuit in Fullerton, California, and looking at this issue in other places. So that's just context for where we come from as an organization. Just really quickly, in response to the fantastic findings from Karthik, Janelle, and their colleagues, it's really great to see such detailed data on Asian American and Pacific Islander voters, both ethnically and also looking at California. One thing that jumped out at me is that there's the data that's captured here is very recent. The polling was just done within the last few weeks, and it's highly consistent with what others, including Advancing Justice LA, have seen over 20 plus years of tracking Asian American and Pacific Islander voters in California. I think the high number of unaffiliated or non-party affiliated Asian American and Pacific Islander voters is completely consistent with a trend we've been noticing for the last couple of decades. Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders lead, I think, all racial groups in being unaffiliated, so having the highest number of voters who refuse to align with a particular political party. And that is sort of the trend that is happening in general now, but Asian Americans and Pacific Islander voters have been at the cutting edge of that trend for a number of years. So that 35 to 40% number of people who are not registered with either party is pretty consistent. The other trend that I was happy to see in the data that Karthik and Janelle put out was also something we've seen in our own polling. The most recent one is a little bit older. We did a poll earlier this year, issued in March of 2016, a few months ago, but very similar trends around the progressive direction of Asian American and Pacific Islander voters. So our poll, very consistent with what Janelle and Karthik presented, shows that Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, regardless of party identification, tend to be good on issues like legalizing immigration, increasing taxes to support education, support for the Affordable Care Act, et cetera. So I think it's great to see that poll after poll is now showing that despite the myth that Asian American and Pacific Islander voters tend to be more socially conservative, we're actually seeing that shift fundamentally, I think, within recent years with the polling that both of our groups have done. And the last thing I'll mention around voters is one thing that I don't think was captured as directly in the poll, but I think is sort of implied because the poll was done in, I think, at least 6 languages. Janelle and Karthik can correct me if I got that wrong, but a number of Asian languages. And the reason I highlight that is because we have seen time and time again that language assistance is key to Asian American and Pacific Islander voting, but particularly for Asian immigrants. And the denial of language assistance that's actually required by law, we view as tantamount to voter suppression. So our data we've seen over the years is that limited English proficiency amongst Asian American voters is probably around 1/3 of voters overall, but in some communities like Korean and Vietnamese, it's as high as 40 to 50%, even a little bit higher in some communities. And the use of bilingual assistance to vote is also similarly very high. In fact, our data from a few years ago showed that Koreans, 60% of Koreans use bilingual assistance to vote, and Vietnamese was about 50%. So I wanted to just stress that for our particular communities, polling in language and providing voting assistance in language is critical for our communities to actually be able to cast a vote, to exercise our right to vote, and not being able to do so is essentially voter suppression. And that's one of the reasons why Advancing Justice will be going out across California to monitor poll sites on Election Day to make sure that required language assistance is actually being provided anywhere from the Bay Area to Central Valley to the Inland Empire to LA, Orange, and San Diego counties. And that would be sort of my formal remarks, and I know we want to save some time for questions. So thank you again to Karthik and Janelle for having us on the call.
Great. Thanks, Karen. We'll just end with some remarks from Alton, who'll say briefly about what API Vote is doing now that we're less than a month away from Election Day. And Alton, I guess you will handle just tell us some of the questions that have been coming in.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. So for those of you who don't know, Asian and Pacific Islander American Vote is a national nonpartisan organization focused on voter mobilization and civic participation in Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. This year, we have partners in field programs in 25 states across the country, as well as other campaigns, including partnerships with Rock the Vote and other organizations for online digital mobilization of younger Asian Americans and Pacific Islander voters. Currently, we have mailers that have gone out, and as the mailers are dropping, we're getting calls on our hotline, hotline, Election Protection and Voter Information Hotline 1-888-API Vote, that we conduct in conjunction with Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. And this voter protection hotline focuses on, obviously, the Asian American and Pacific Islander electorate. We have language assistance available in 8 Asian languages, from Chinese, Korean, Vietnamese to Urdu, Bengali, and Hindi, and a few others. This hotline is already live and ready to service our voters, whether it's questions about voting in the elections or to report any issues that they face in this election cycle. This data is, really critical for us and for our partners to engage our communities better. For example, the specific data on Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders is really critical for our partners in Utah and Washington that have more significant NHPI populations. This year, API Vote is also pushing out PSAs and other material and resources that are available online, really focused on kickstarting and pushing forward this conversation around the election and hoping to mobilize our communities to the vote. So now I'm going to transition to some of the questions that we've gotten through the question function. Please continue to submit those questions, and I will direct them to our panelists today. So one question that we had early on from Angela was, I think this is for you, Karthik. The results among Vietnamese American respondents stand out, such as the weaker favorability of Obama and leaning more towards GOP stands out among all other ethnicities. Can you discuss this and possible reasons why?
Yes, so for Vietnamese Americans, they traditionally have been a Republican-leaning group, and that dates back to their refugee experiences where they saw the Republican Party as stronger in combating communism than the Democratic Party. So there's still some of a legacy effect from that. But what's interesting and important to note is that despite the lower favorability rating for President Obama and Hillary Clinton, for example, and also the lower identification with the Democratic Party, when you look at their vote choice in November, it looks like Hillary Clinton will win the Vietnamese American vote, much like Barack Obama won the Vietnamese American vote in 2012. So this community is still very much in transition, and it seems to be shifting towards the Democratic Party in terms of its voting behavior, if not its party identification. Finally, I'll just say that on certain issues like government assistance on education, support for the Affordable Care Act, and in the past when we've asked about support for universal health care, Vietnamese Americans have been among the strongest supporters of those measures.
Great. Another question comes from Christopher, who asks, comparing California data with national data, what are the biggest takeaways, whether it is in terms of similarities or especially dissimilarities and differences?
So what we found, so this was this is a fair amount of work to do. We did a completely different set of weighting to take into account sub-regions in California. And after all that analysis, there aren't that many differences. A couple of the ones that stick out, I think, that are notable include millennial voters in California who seem to be more willing to support a third-party candidate than millennial voters outside of California. So that ends up being a significant difference. Trump does a little bit better in California than outside of California. Obama is not viewed quite as favorably, although he's still viewed very favorably in California compared to nationally, and similarly for Clinton as well. So there are some of these differences when it comes to favorability ratings. But when it comes to the bottom line, if you will, in terms of what the presidential election is going to look like, it looks very similar. One thing I will note is when it comes to the Senate race in California, it's remarkable the very high proportion of Asian American voters who say they do not know who they'll vote for between Democratic candidate Kamala Harris and Democratic candidate Loretta Sanchez. In many ways, this is a function of the top two primary system in California, where the top two vote getters this time around for the Senate race were Democrat. But we've seen in the past that Asian American voters don't understand the top two system very well. So that suggests that there's still a lot of work that needs to be done to get Asian Americans more effectively engaged in that. I don't know, Karen, if you had any thoughts about the top two system in California.
I'm sorry, what was the question, Karthik?
So what we found in 2012 when we asked Asian American voters how well they understood the top two primary system, a very small proportion of them understood what it was and what it meant. including the fact that you might have two people from the same party running in the general election against each other.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have any data analysis to add to it. I do think anecdotally that is true, that I don't think people in California, although we've had it now for several years, understand the top two system or what the implications are at the primary level, for example. So nothing new to add, but would agree with you that there's a lot of confusion and not a lot of clarity around what that means and its implication for how elections play out here.
Right.
Great. Another question is asking if there are regional differences, or in another sense, is there anything we can learn if we break up California by region, whether it's Northern California, Southern California, and Central California?
So we accounted for this in our weighting, but that's an excellent question, and what we'll do right after the presentation is to fix the one error that we noted on the California slides. We'll upload those, and we'll produce the Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander slides and upload those within a couple of hours. But then we will we're still doing a few more data collections. We already have enough data in the Bay Area, Central Valley, Los Angeles County, and we combine Orange County and San Diego together. We'll see if we can get some more results to maybe break those two counties up, but we will have regional analysis. We hope to have it soon, probably by the end of the week.
Karthik, this is Karen. If I could just jump in. One thing, I mentioned the polling we did, which in March, and one of the things we looked a little bit at regional differences, primarily between Bay Area and LA. And one thing that we saw, which would be interesting to see if you see this as well, is that, because I think you do capture foreign-born versus native-born, and I think where Asian American populations have a higher concentration of foreign-born, I do think that's where you see some of the breaks on kind of the social political issues in terms of like political progressiveness versus more political conservatism. With foreign-born communities like San Gabriel Valley, which is a very high concentration of newer immigrants, I think showing a little bit more of that political conservativeness versus places where Asian Americans might be more second or third generation, like San Francisco. But that's something we saw in some of our data, which we didn't publish, but which is some of the stuff we reviewed internally. But given your set of data, it would be interesting to see if you see that result as well.
Great. We had a couple questions about party affiliation identification. One was, do the data show a loyalty for political party, show loyalty in terms of political party affiliation? In other words, of those who self-identify their party preference, how much do they keep up their party line up and down the ballot? And then I think in tandem, another question is the trend of non-identification with either party and of being undecided a threat to Asian Americans as a viable political force and or a sign of lack of Asian American unity?
Well, I'll take the second question first, and I don't know if Janelle wants to tackle the first one. In terms of what we should make of, we didn't ask about people's party registration. We asked about their identification. But as Karen from Advancing Justice noted, there's a very high proportion of no party preference among Asian American voters in California. Now, that said, they might not call themselves Democrat, but they sure seem to be voting like Democrats. And this is true even among Vietnamese Americans, right? So Vietnamese Americans are the ones least likely to either identify or say that they feel closer to the Democratic Party. But when you look at their vote preferences, even they are more likely to say that they're going to vote for a Democrat as opposed to a Republican at the presidential level and even at the congressional level. And so that is something, it's still the reason why you have such high non-identification is that Asian Americans are the only racial group in California and in the country that are majority foreign born. And so many of them are still trying to figure out the political system. And quite honestly, they might even just be reluctant to use that label. It might not feel as natural to them, not having grown up, at least for a big chunk of their childhood and even their college years or other adult years in the United States. So party identification looks quite different from voting patterns. In terms of consistency between the what they say they'll vote at the presidential level and the congressional level, we see, at least in the top lines, that it's pretty consistent. I don't want to lose this screen here, so I will ask Janelle if she can run the numbers while we're answering maybe one or two final questions.
Okay, so Karthik, I am a fire alarm just hit in my office, and so I had to go outside. I hope folks can hear me. In terms of whether it's a disadvantage or not for Asian Americans to exhibit such high levels of nonpartisanship, I think we do see some reluctance on the part of the two major parties to mobilize Asian Americans because they are uncertain of whether their vote will go towards their candidate. And so on the one hand, you could see this group as very much swing voters who are not tied to a particular party. On the other hand, I think that given scarce resources, given the importance of reaching out to Asian American voters in language, that parties have been very, very slow to devote those necessary resources, especially when they're not certain about the loyalty of those voters.
And I think a final question here that we have is, was there enough data to disaggregate for Muslim Asian Americans? And if so, any findings there?
We do have a question on religion, and I don't know if we have enough respondents in California per se, but that's a great question, and we will. Janelle Wong has she has a book under review on religion in Asian American and Latino communities. So Janelle, I don't know if you've already done some of that analysis, but that's certainly something that we should be looking into.
Yes, I think that I don't look at that particular question about Muslim Asian Americans, but I think that it remains a very strong interest among this research team, and we have been continuing to try to figure out how we might survey Muslim Asian Americans in a post-election survey.
Great. So I think that's all the questions. Just reminding everyone that this information will be sent out to you, and Karthik will be uploading the slides and other materials onto the NAAS website. Anything else, Karthik?
Yep, that's it. So that's our website right there. And like I said, the company of data will be up very shortly with NHPI data to follow later on today.
Great. Thank you for joining us, everyone.